Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Casual Criminalist. Today, car thief, kidnapper monster, the Beast of Belgium. Oh no, not a car thief. It's like, normally if I saw that title, I'd be like, yes, a little bit of levity. But then the fact that he's a kidnapper and monster and he's called the Beast makes it sound like he's up to a whole lot worse than being a car thief. We're going to find out because the format of this show is Emma has written me a script. Thank you, Emma. I'm going to read it. Never read it before. Let's discover this story together, dear audience. Unless you're familiar with it already. In that case, you know more than me. And I'm the one making this bloody video. Let's go. I'm usually picky about the cases I decide to cover on The Casual Criminalist. If I'm going to be living with a case for 2 weeks that it takes to research and write about it, I need it to be interesting and unique on some level. Usually, I'm pretty excited about researching these cases, and it's not unusual for me to swear under my breath or mutter curses or cheer out loud when justice is finally being done. Yeah. As everybody who watches this show knows, yeah, me too. It's like, get him in the chair! Yes! Just before we continue, Vessi, perhaps my favorite sponsor of all time, have a new shoe out. This is the Courtside Classic. It's a great looking shoe. It's a little bit of a different look for Vessi. They got this new logo thing on the tongue here, which looks like it's a very classic look, which is probably why they call it the Courtside Classic, right? But of course, with Vessi, it has all of the stuff that Vessi is so famous for. One, it's made of Diamond Tech, so it's 100% waterproof. Something that I don't mention very often when I talk about Vessi, but I feel like I should, is when you first buy these shoes, you put them on and you're like, oh, it's a bit tight. Did I order the right size? And you did order the right size. And what they do is after you've worn them for, I don't know, a couple of hours, they, like socks, form to fit your feet perfectly. So then you have this ridiculously comfortable pair of shoes, which is waterproof, which looks fantastic. I mean, it's a great looking shoe. I've worn Vessis for years now. It's all I wear. That's it. Vessis. They're fantastic. You should pick yourself up a pair of these Courtside Classics. I don't know what else to say other than you will not regret buying Vessis because they're awesome. Visit vessi.com/TCC to grab yourself a pair and you'll get 15% off your first purchase at checkout. Big thank you to Vessi, as always, for sponsoring. Appreciate you guys. And now back to today's episode. But every now and then, I know that the case I'm working on that month will be particularly tough and that I'll need to keep the tissues ready. This is one of those cases. Oh no. Why can't it just be about a car thief? What's today's casual? Oh, he's a car thief. He's a gentleman robber. It's like, no. This is the Beast. Summer of 95. The 24th of June 1995 was a warm, sunny Saturday, and the first day of the summer holidays in Belgium. 8-year-old Julie Lejeune was looking forward to their end-of-year school dance performance. She'd been listening and dancing to the soundtrack since her father gifted her the CD the previous day, and that afternoon at around 3 p.m, her mother Louisa drove her to her best friend Melissa's house so that they could practice the routine. This is so sweet. My kid right now is... I don't know. It's just going to... Telling this story is maybe going to be even worse about what's going to happen. But it's like lately my kid, she goes to a dance class on Tuesday afternoons, I think. And she is like practicing for a performance in a few weeks. And she's always like, Dad, look what I can do. Look what I can do. And she'll show me some little dance thing. And it just gets like, a little bit better every day. I'm like, oh, this is so nice. I never thought I'd look forward to going to a dance performance of 4-year-olds, but I'm very excited to see this. Melissa Russo lived on the outskirts of the city of Liège, and after they'd finished practicing, the two girls convinced Melissa's mother, Corinne, to let them walk to the overpass near their house. Melissa and her older brother used to wave at the cars that passed on the highway and would cheer when the motorists greeted them with loud honks, and Melissa was eager to introduce her best friend to her new favourite pastime. This sounds dangerous. Like, one, you're really near a busy highway, and two, this is like bad for drivers as well, because you're like, oh look, the children waving hello, but boom, you're in a horrible car accident. Corinne agreed and watched as the two girls happily made their way down the dirt road, past the golden wheat field and on toward the bridge. After a few minutes, she decided to join them, got onto her bicycle and rode towards the bridge, but the two girls were nowhere to be seen. Louise Lejeune drove towards the Russo house at around 6 p.m. to pick Julie up, but she came across a panicked Corinne instead. Corinne told her that the girls had walked toward the bridge, but that she'd checked the route several times now and had even rode her bicycle down some of the other roads nearby, but she couldn't find them anywhere. The two women drove around in Louise's car looking for the girls, but when 30 minutes passed without any sign of their daughters, they called the police. According to Louise, I'd say the police arrived within about 15 minutes. They asked us some basic questions. I'm not sure how long that lasted. I think they asked us for pictures of the girls, and we gave them the ones we had at the time. I admit that at one point that night, I had some very bad thoughts that maybe they'd been picked up by a bad person who would kill them and that would find them somewhere nearby. Yeah, of course. Like, I think this is one of those situations where if it's you, you're just there and you're like, oh, it's probably nothing. But you're still like, uh-oh. It's like they're probably going to show up after they got lost walking in the woods or something, but you're still like, uh-oh. During the next 2 days, 6 different witnesses came forward to say that they'd seen Julie and Melissa that afternoon. A cyclist who had passed underneath the bridge said that he'd seen them standing on top of the bridge where they'd happily wave at passing cars. A couple had walked by the two girls, who'd waved hello, and the couple had waved back. One of Russo's neighbours, 71-year-old Marie-Louise Henrot, had been sitting by the window in her bedroom and had watched the two girls as they walked past the wheat fields towards home. She'd seen a dark-coloured car stop next to the two girls and had seen a dark-haired man get out. He opened the back door for the two girls, who got into the car without a struggle. The old lady had assumed that they knew the man, so she didn't think much of it until the police came knocking at her door. That's the thing, it's like one of those things you see and you're like, I mean, there's a 0.001% chance that guy's kidnapping those girls. That the rest of that chance is like, yeah, they're just getting in a car. They're just being picked up by someone they know. The cyclist told the police that he'd seen a red car parked in the emergency lane just past the bridge. It had to swerve out of the way to avoid hitting the car. 4 other witnesses would later corroborate his story, with 2 of them adding that there was also a van parked in the emergency lane. One of the witnesses told the police that the red car had Belgian number plates that started with either NKV or NVK. The car was small. Marie-Louise thought that it must have been a Peugeot 206, but she wasn't sure. Peugeot 206 is like, this is what, mid-90s? Peugeot 206 is like a car of, it was like, must have been one of the most popular cars on the road back in the day. It was a car of my childhood. Other witnesses said it was a Ford Fiesta, a very rather similar looking car, same era, same size. But 2 days after Julie and Melissa had disappeared, a woman contacted the police to say that the person who'd taken Julie and Melissa had tried to kidnap her daughter earlier that day. What the f***? If someone kidnapped my daughter, I'd be like, you ain't going, like, I'd be like by her side like all the time. That's crazy. Wait, what? Earlier in the year, in both March and May, a man driving a red car offered to take the girls for a ride. On June the 24th, 1995 at noon, the girls were playing outside. I saw my daughter moving away from the car. It was a red Ford Fiesta. I saw my daughter was afraid. I got closer and saw that my daughter's friend, Diana, was sitting in the passenger seat of the car. I literally ripped her out of the car. The driver tried to keep her from getting out and then took off. I got a good look at him. He looked to be around 1.70 m tall, 5'8", thin, with short, dark hair parted on the right, brown eyes, wearing a blue and green striped shirt with dark trousers. Okay, so why is this man not in prison for trying to kidnap children? That's, like, what's up? Her daughter had told her that the man had one hand on the steering wheel and had offered to give them candy. Jesus Christ, he's being a stereotypical P-word. In his other hand, he held a dirty, damp handkerchief. Because her mother had already warned her that it was dangerous to get into cars with strange men, she hadn't wanted to go near him, giving her mother enough time to catch up with all of them. The woman's description of the man matched the one provided by Marie-Louise, and her description of the car matched with the other witness statements. With the pictures of Julie and Melissa on them were posted all over Liège, and then every town and city all over Belgium. Wait, what? I mean, they've got like half the numbers on the license plate. They've got that it's a Ford Fiesta. They've got that it's red. They know that it's owned by a dude. I mean, it very thoroughly narrowed down right there, even if a Peugeot 206 is a common car. Their photos graced the bridge where they'd stood that afternoon. Their parents spoke to the media, made television appearances where they criticised the police's lack of progress, and begged their daughter's kidnappers to bring them back home. The wheat field was searched, riverbeds were scoured, and thousands of volunteers helped to look for the two girls. 2 months later, 2 more girls disappeared. They were 17-year-old Anne Marchal and the 19-year-old Yves Lambrex. They'd been on holiday with friends in the coastal town of Ostend, and on the 22nd of August 1995, they'd travelled by tram to Blankenberg. Anne and Yves attended a magic show performed by Rassi Rastelli, a well-known Dutch hypnotist. During the show, the two girls were called on stage and took part in the act, and afterwards, witnesses say that they both looked a bit dazed from the experience. Well, yeah, it's like hypnosis. It's kind of what it does. Allegedly. If it actually works at all, which I'm not sure it does. Just before midnight, and the girls were seen outside of a bar called Hotel Brazil. They then caught the last tram to Ostend at 12:44 a.m. and arrived at the last tram station at 1:15 a.m., where they were spotted by a taxi driver. They'd planned to hitchhike the 13.5 kilometers back to the bungalow that they shared with their friends. At most, the walk would have taken them around 2 hours. Oh my god, that'd be so... You just taken a tram for like half an hour to the end of the line, and then you've got a 2-hour walk back home at 1 o'clock in the morning. Oh, after probably a few drinky drinks. Anne and Yvesha didn't return to the bungalow that morning, and when they still weren't back by that evening, their friends called the police. The police listened to their story, but told them that Anne and Yvesha were probably still out partying. After all, this was the summer holidays, and they were teenage girls. It wasn't unusual for them to disappear for days on end during the holidays, only to resurface a few days later once the drunk drugs and alcohol had run out. According to Jean Lambret, Yvesha's father, they did not draw up a missing persons report. They said that Anne and Yvesha must have gone out. They'll return soon. But during those first days, nothing was done. I mean, how old are they? 17 and 19? This is the thing. They're one of them's an adult, and there's a big difference between missing adults and missing kids. Because adults go missing, it's generally because they want to go missing. Kids go missing, it's not usually because they want to go missing. In fact, they never want to go missing because they're kids. They don't get to make that decision. So, I get it, but still maybe a little something. I mean, 17 could be an excuse for the police to do something, maybe? When they didn't get anywhere with the police, Anne and Yvesha's friends called their parents. Anne's father and Yvesha's mother reported their children as missing to the local police and then raced to Ostend. According to Paul Marshall, they questioned their daughter's friends as soon as they arrived, but didn't learn much, so he went to Anne's room to take a nap. Wait. Wait, what? According to Marshall. Wait, who's Paul Marshall? And why is he having a nap? What's going on? I found Anne's cherished stuffed Snoopy on her pillow. Okay, wait, is this her dad? Is this her dad? This wasn't made clear. Was it made clear? Did I miss something? I found Anne's cherished stuffed Snoopy on her pillow. The little ribbon around Snoopy's neck was still there. It had a note attached in her handwriting offering a reward of 100 francs for Snoopy's safe return in case he went missing. It was at that moment that it really hit me. Something terrible must have happened to Anne. In the days following their disappearance, Anne and Yvesha's parents did what they could to let the world know about their missing girls. According to journalist Douglas DeConnick, I remember very well when Paul Marshall came into the office. He said, please put Anne's photo on the front page. And I think we were laughing at him, like, oh god, this poor man, his daughter is surely somewhere partying with some friends, and she'll show up in a few days. Okay, so yeah, it was the father. I thought it was the police at first. I'm like, wait, why are the police just taking a nap in their house? That makes a lot more sense. But now there were 4 families whose daughters had gone missing within just 2 months, and the people of Belgium couldn't help but notice. Missing posters with their faces were posted everywhere. These posters made their way to the Netherlands, Germany, France, Mexico, South America, and Madagascar. What is it? Madagascar? Because their families had been told that they might have been trafficked. To Madagascar? What's going on in Madagascar? Their families followed up on every lead they could, spoke to every witness, and pestered the police for more information about their missing daughters. And when their questions were met with silence, they hired private detectives. They kept detailed notes on the events surrounding their daughters' disappearances, and they kept on fighting to have their voices heard and their daughters' names spoken. But 11 months after Julie and Melissa had gone missing, another family joined their ranks. 12-year-old Sabine Dardenne had lived in Tournai and had been on her way to school when she disappeared. That morning, she'd been wearing black trainers, blue jeans, a white top, and a red sweater that her grandmother had gifted to her. Her bicycle was a metallic green Dunlop VTT, and on the back of it was a red nylon bag that contained her swimwear. Her mother had only realized that something was wrong when Sabine didn't return home that evening and didn't hesitate to report her daughter as missing. Only this time, the police had nothing to work with. No one had seen Sabine that morning, her bike was never found, and no one had seen any suspicious vehicles in the area. It was like she'd disappeared into thin air. Her parents would also make several television appearances, begging her kidnappers to bring her home, and in a lot of ways, the other 4 families had already paved the way for them, ensuring that they had no difficulty in letting the world know that Sabine was missing. A hotline was set up, helicopters searched the area, and the police scoured the neighborhood. See, this is what happens when a 12-year-old goes missing versus a 19-year-old. 500 volunteers and 116 soldiers meticulously searched the countryside for weeks after her disappearance, and both her mother and grandmother kept their back doors unlocked just in case Sabine had run away and decided to come home. Within days, Sabine's missing posters joined the already fading ones that contained pictures of Julie, Melissa, Anne, and Yvesha. Parents all over Belgium kept their children close and made sure that they didn't go anywhere alone. In the podcast on the case, Le Monstre, American-born Matt Graves explains, quoting, 5 girls had now gone missing without a trace. The country was waking up to the fact that all 5 disappearances were strikingly similar and possibly connected. Of course, they had no idea what kind of storm would soon be unleashed on their country. The Stroppy Little Madam. Now's a good time to let you know that Sabine survived. Is she the 12-year-old? Excellent. Okay, that's good. And the information from this chapter comes directly from her book, I Choose to Live, which she wrote shortly before her 21st birthday. After she was rescued, Sabine was told that some people had thought that she'd just run away, and she had explained that it made sense since she'd just informed her parents that she'd failed maths and that she'd been in trouble over it. She was a strong-willed person and prone to throwing a tantrum when her mother asked her to help out around the house, and she was perfectly aware that her mother was often disappointed with her youngest daughter's behavior, quoting, I know people had me down as a stroppy little madam, but as long as it didn't affect what I did, I wasn't bothered what they called me. In fact, I thought this stroppy little madam was probably my best friend, and this is still the case. Sabine explains that around 7:30 a.m. on the morning of the 28th of May, 1996, she was riding a bicycle to school. Sabine used to meet up with her best friend Davina, and the two of them would ride to school together. If either of them were late, the other would just continue to school. So when Davina wasn't waiting for Sabine at the gate to her house, Sabine didn't stop to wait for her and kept on riding. Not long after, Sabine heard a vehicle approaching from behind her. She pulled over to the right side of the road to let it pass and glanced over her left shoulder when the beat-up van drew even with her. Quoting, it was a real old banger, the kind of beaten-up camper van that looked as if it was lived in by squatters. 3 seats in the front and a miserable bunk thing in the back, and disgusting brown and yellow check curtains with hundreds of car stickers plastered over the windows. The side door slid open, a hand closed around her mouth, and an arm came around her chest, and then a screaming Sabine was flying through the air. The next thing she knew, she'd been bundled into an old blanket, and a man was trying to force 2 pills down her throat. She spat them out and kicked and screamed and yelled and asked her kidnapper who the he thought he was. The van stopped, and the driver hopped out. He tossed her bike into the back of the van, and then they sped off again. Quoting again, the whole thing, the snatching, the yelling, the stop, the flinging of my things into the van, had taken no more than a minute. Sabine took to calling the man who held her down the greasy creep and referred to the driver as the little nerd. So there are 2 of them. Okay, the greasy creep was obviously in charge, and he barked orders at both the struggling Sabine and the little nerd. They both had dark hair, and they both spoke with an accent that told her that they weren't from the French-speaking region of Belgium. The greasy creep forced 2 more pills down her throat, and then pressed a Coke bottle to her mouth, forcing her to swallow. Sabine eventually stopped struggling, but she didn't know if it was because of the pills or because she was just tired. 2 hours later, the van came to a stop, and Sabine was forced to climb into a blue metal trunk. She explains that it wasn't much bigger than a toolbox, and her kidnappers had to fold her body into 4 parts to get her to fit. The 2 men then carried the trunk into a house, and Sabine was let out. She'd explained that she only saw a few rooms in the rundown house. The entire house was filthy and covered in dust and building rubble, and the racks of clothes and toys that littered the rooms told her that a woman and child had once lived here. There was the front room that contained a kitchenette, a half-built fireplace, a table and chairs, a telephone, a microwave, some toys. There was a second room that she would be kept in whenever someone unexpectedly knocked on the front door. There was a bathroom, a hallway with a makeshift sunroof, a bedroom that contained 2 bunk beds, boxes that were overflowing with clothes and other belongings, and a dinosaur poster above the wall. The main bedroom, where the greasy creep slept, was just as disorganized and dirty and contained the bed, racks of clothes, and a television. Later, she'd refer to it as the Calvary, or the agony room. I couldn't bring myself to admit that I had been well and truly kidnapped. The whole thing had been too well done, too quick, right from the first day while I was still stupefied with fear and my head muddled with drugs, so I had to believe everything I was told. For the first 3 days, Sabine was kept chained to one of the bunk beds in the second bedroom. On the second day, the greasy creep took her to the agony room, stripped her bare, chained her to the bed, took photos of her, and then had his way with her. Afterwards, he took her back to the second bedroom, chained her to the bed, sat down next to her, and graciously explained what was going on. Quoting, "You're not to worry. Personally, I've got nothing against you. In fact, I saved your life, but the boss really has it in for you, so he wants money from your parents." He explained that Sabine's father, an ex-police officer, had somehow slighted the boss, and they were now holding her for ransom. Sabine asked how much money they wanted, and the creep explained the ransom amount was 3 million francs. In response, Sabine scoffed at the creep, fully aware that her parents didn't have that kind of money. He then brought the nerd in to corroborate his story, but the nerd never met her eyes, and Sabine wasn't impressed with the nerd's one-word statements and didn't believe a word he said. But on the third day, the creep told Sabine that her parents had refused to pay a ransom and that the boss now wanted her dead. Sabine had a choice. The creep could hand her over to the boss, who would sexually torture her until she died, or she could live there with him since her parents no longer wanted her. Oh, God. Quoting again, I can't be sure of the exact wording, but what he offered was a stark choice. Live or die. Naturally, I chose to live. The creep then took Sabine down a narrow, unfinished staircase that had been dug into the earth and ordered her not to touch the walls or he'd beat her. The staircase led into the cellar, where he'd built a hidey hole. The hidey hole was hidden behind some metal shelving that had bolted to the wall. The shelf was stacked with packs of bottled water, beer, and cool drinks. Once the shelves were cleared, the creep would pull on the bottom shelf, which then slid upwards on a metal rail and revealed a cleverly hidden door behind it. The door was heavy and made of bricks, and there was barely enough space for Sabine to squeeze past it. Behind the door was a metal gate and a tiny room that had been painted a bright yellow. The room was 3 feet by 9 feet, and it contained an old sponge mattress that was covered with a scratchy blanket. To the side, there was a bench and a little wooden shelf up on the wall and a bucket at the foot of the bed. The creep had left a shopping bag containing a few snacks for Sabine, a plastic container full of water, as well as an old television and a Sega gaming console that stood on some old boxes. Her school bag had been placed on the bed. She had 2 little lamps that provided her with some light, and the creep proudly explained that it even installed a ventilation fan for her so that she'd always have fresh air. When Sabine saw all the effort he'd put into her new accommodations, the little madam reportedly turned to him and said, "You've got to be joking." But of course he wasn't. The creep told her that the house belonged to the boss and that some of the other gang members might come looking for her. Since he was trying to save her life, he had to hide her away. If she wanted to live, she had to stay in the hidey hole, do as he said, and keep quiet. If the boss or any of his goons found out where she was, she'd die. If she heard someone else, either inside the house or inside the cellar, she couldn't call out or make a sound, or the boss and his other men would come and find her. She had to keep quiet until she heard the creep say the secret code word, "It's me." According to Sabine, quote, "I would die if I refused to be sexually assaulted. I would die if I made any noise. In fact, I lived under a permanent sentence of death." In the days and weeks that followed, Sabine would keep herself busy by reading her textbooks, trying to improve her math skills, copying out lines from her French and Dutch textbooks, drawing and playing games on the Sega console, and writing everything that happened to her down in her school diary. To keep herself sane, she kept track of the days on a small calendar in her diary. She noted when the creep was home and when he left. When he was gone, she ate expired biscuits and knickknacks and conserved the little water he'd leave for her. When he was home, he'd either take her upstairs to the agony room or to the kitchen for meals, where she made a point of nagging at him. He drank coffee, but I wasn't allowed to, so I went on at him until he gave me a little percolator and instant coffee. It was cold, so I went on him until he gave me some sort of heating. I pestered and badgered whenever I thought I could get away with it. Once he called me a bloody pain in the arse, probably when I was snivelling too much. When it dawned on me that he actually seemed to enjoy it when I cried, I decided then and there to give it up, at least in front of him. And just a reminder that this girl is 12 years old. She has excellent presence of mind for someone of that age. It's not to say that she wasn't terrified. She was only 12 after all, there we go. Emma also thought it was a good time for a reminder about that. She was terrified that he might hit her, but he never did. She was terrified that he'd leave her in her hidey hole for weeks on end. She was terrified of the lights in her little hidey hole going out and leaving her in the dark. She was terrified of the boss finding out that she was still alive, but most of all, she was terrified of the idea that her parents really had abandoned her. Quoting again, "I always felt myself to be an outsider. I knew that my parents had never wanted me, that my birth was an accident. If this was a joke, it was one that backfired, because I took it literally, communication never having been a strong point in our family." Sabine goes on to explain that her mother often reminded her that she wasn't good enough. She wasn't as smart as her older sisters. She wasn't as polite or nice or helpful. Over and over, she could hear her mother say, "Failed again, Sabine," the very words she'd said to Sabine the night before she disappeared. So of course, it made sense that when her parents had decided which of their daughters they'd be willing to sacrifice, it was Sabine. Again, this is like, I was just saying, good presence of mind for a 12-year-old, but she's still 12. She could think this way. Sometime in June 1996, Sabine had asked the creep if we would allow her to write a letter to her parents. She wasn't allowed to use the telephone in the front room to call her family since the creep had told her that the boss was always listening in and that he'd know that she was still alive. But eventually, the creep agreed to deliver a letter to her parents. Sabine estimates that she wrote 5 or 6 letters to her family. In these letters, she'd beg her parents to pay the ransom so that she could come home. She apologized for whatever she'd done wrong and promised to be a better daughter, but explained that she also understood that they were all in danger and that they would be killed if the boss found out she was still alive. These letters are not getting delivered, right? Sabine asked about their days, if they were looking after a vegetable garden, how her dog Sam and her fish Tiffy were doing. and if her grandmother's arthritis was back. And she told them that the creep wasn't giving her proper food. The meat often tasted rancid, and almost all the food he gave her was from generic brands which were well past their sell-by dates. He also didn't give her proper bread when he locked her in the hidey hole, only the pre-cut factory stuff that would go moldy after a day. She could only have margarine, not butter, and the milk he gave her was often curdled. She had to nag at him to allow her to wear underwear, otherwise she'd have to walk around naked the entire time. He wouldn't even allow her to take a proper bath, and when he did bathe her, he'd scrub her body raw. He'd even dared to cut her fringe shorter because it bothered him and referred to her as his girlfriend. She also told her mother what the creep did to her when he took her up to the agony room, how he would tie her to the bed and take nude photos of her before he put himself through his paces. Some days he'd force her to watch porn with him and sleep in the same bed as him, and then she'd try and come up with ways to escape her chains and run away. Every time he took her to the agony room, Sabine would scream and yell and fight back. She'd tell him no, she'd call him an arsehole, and tell him that what he was doing was sick and unnatural. No matter how scared she was, Sabine was determined to fight back, to let him know that she would never break, and she reassured her family of that. Her parents never wrote back to her, but the creep helpfully relayed those messages to her. He told her that her mother had said she had to count her blessings and that things could be much worse for her. Her mother reportedly said that Sabine had to learn to wash better and that she would just have to learn to like what the creep was doing to her. But after 2 months of being locked up with just the creep for company, Sabine begged him to allow her to go outside, to call someone, to allow her to have a friend. Of course, he refused, but then he went away for a week, and when he got back, Sabine was forced to spend an entire day with him in the agony room. Afterward, she crawled onto her bed and marked the date with a big red star to indicate that it had been a particularly bad day, and then wrote everything she'd experienced into a private letter addressed to her mother, telling her about all the really big problems she was having, and that she'd really appreciate if they could come and save her now. It took her body a few days to recover, and when the creep left on her trip, Sabine cried in relief. But on the 77th day after she had been kidnapped, the creep took Sabine upstairs and told her that he had a surprise for her. Asleep on the bottom bunk, in the second bedroom, was another drugged girl. The creep had brought a friend for Sabine, just like she'd asked, and all she could think was, what had I done? This is so f***ed up. I'm glad that the details are not included, because I don't need to know the details. You don't need to know the details. We don't want the details. The sixth girl. "14-year-old Letitia Delhaz had disappeared on Friday, the 9th of August 1996 in the town of Bertrix. She'd spent the day shopping with her mother and cleaning the house, and that evening at around 7:30 p.m, she and her older sister had walked to the public pool. Since it was summer, the sun wouldn't set until around 9 p.m, so it was still light out. The town was filled with tourists and other holidaygoers, and Letitia would later explain that, quote, "Because I had my period, I didn't actually go swimming. My sister and her boyfriend went off somewhere, so I hung around for a bit until I got fed up with watching everyone else having a great time and decided to go home. The pool isn't that far from our house, so I walked back, and then this old van pulled up, and the driver asked if there was anything going on in Bertrix. I told him it was the 24-hour scootathon. The man made out as if he didn't quite understand, and in less than 2 minutes, I was bundled up. And that was that." The guy in the van was the nerd, and while he'd been distracting Letitia, the creep had come up from behind and grabbed her. Again, she barely had time to fight back before a handful of pills were shoved into her mouth and a bottle of Fanta was pressed to her lips, forcing her to swallow. She spat the first pills out, but then the creep gave her a second, heavier dose, and she eventually passed out. She didn't remember much regarding what happened over the next 3 days. She vaguely remembered arriving at the rundown house, only just remembered being chained to a bed, being forced to drink contraceptives, and being initiated by the creep. He told her the same story he had told Sabine, that he was part of a gang, and Letitia was being held for ransom. Shortly after Letitia was introduced to Sabine, the creep told her that her parents had refused to pay the ransom, and her life was now forfeit. Then he made Letitia the same offer that he'd made to Sabine. "Do you want to live or not?" Afterwards, she was taken down to the hidey hole, and Sabine was ordered to fill Letitia in on what would be expected of her. It was during this time when Letitia told Sabine that, quote, "I've seen you before. Your photo is everywhere, and that's where I've seen you. Belgium is covered with posters of you, and your parents are going mad trying to find you." Of course, after 2 months of being told the opposite, Sabine didn't believe her, but she was grateful to have someone to talk to, even if the other person was still mostly doozy from the drugs that she'd been given. So they shared stories and told each other about their lives outside of the hidey hole, all while lying side by side like sardines. According to Sabine, When he eventually came down into the cellar, he told me to stay where I was. It was Laetitia he wanted. I could guess what he was planning to do with her, but in one little corner of my head I felt relief, knowing that for at least a bit, I'd be left alone. Later, I was ashamed of even thinking like this. But back in Bertrix, the search for Laetitia Delhez was in full swing. When Laetitia's sister returned home, she was surprised to hear that Laetitia wasn't back yet. Laetitia's mother and sister then started looking for her, calling her name and asking if anyone had seen her. When they couldn't find her, they called the police. Michael Borlée, who was a provincial King's prosecutor at the time, explains that, quote, "That Saturday morning, around 9 a.m., the phone rang and the police captain informed me that a 14-year-old girl went missing the previous evening in the village of Bertrix. The girl had left the swimming pool at 9 p.m. and hadn't come home afterward. The way from the pool to her house was about a 10 to 15-minute walk through the village and the town square. Her mother reported it to the police, who started investigating right away. They searched the route she would have taken in the area around it. They didn't find anything. Bertrix is 10 minutes away, so I showed up right away." Back then, it wasn't common for prosecutors to be on the scene that quickly, and a lot of people were shocked to see him there. According to Borlée, "At that time, I was conscious of the Julie and Melissa case and all the problems the parents had with the judicial authorities. I didn't want to fall into all of those shortcomings I had perceived and which Julie and Melissa's parents had talked about in the media, the distrust and lack of empathy and information. So I was also there to meet directly with Laetitia's parents. I wasn't in my ivory tower or playing golf somewhere. I was there to show them that we were concerned and that we were there to help." Borlée started his investigation by putting together a timeline of events and correlating them to various witness statements. He also asked that Inspector Judge Jean-Marc Connereau be appointed to the case as soon as he realized that Laetitia hadn't just run away. He also canvassed the streets himself and spoke to the people who claimed that they'd seen something that day. One of them was a nun named Sister Etienne. The previous evening, she'd heard a loud vehicle with a broken exhaust driving past. She noticed that it was a beat-up van and muttered to herself that it was causing a racket. It came to a stop near the swimming pool and stood there for some time. She told the police that it was clanky and had a bunch of stickers in the rear window. A friend of Laetitia's, named Kathy, told the police that she'd seen a strange man enter the men's bathroom that evening and said that her boyfriend, Renier, had also seen him. Renier said that he hadn't seen the man, but he had noticed the van and thought that it looked a bit dodgy. It was a beat-up white van and stickers covered the back windows. Renier thought that it might belong to some thieves, and since his bicycle was locked up nearby, he made a note of the van's number plate, just in case. He was able to tell the police that the van was a white Renault Traffic, and its number plate started with the letters FRR. The police ran a search of all Renault Traffics in Belgium, and then worked through the list of 77 names until they came across one that was familiar, that made alarm bells go off in their head. Marc Dutroux. This is what I was saying they should have done with the Peugeot 206, right? They should have just narrowed it down and then see who's on that list and be like, oh, okay, well, that guy's a sexual predator, so let's start with him, shall we? Like that sort of thing. That would have been that would have been good a bit earlier. No? Couldn't we have done this, 6 pages ago? Come on. The Beast of Belgium. If I could have skipped this section, I would have. I would have loved nothing more than to keep referring to him as simply the creep and move on until he was finally captured, executed, and forgotten about. Unfortunately, Belgium doesn't have the death sentence, and there's a lot more to this story than just the 6 kidnappings that we've covered so far. Oh god, it's already grim enough. There's a lot we don't know about Marc Dutroux's life. We know that he was born in Belgium on the 6th of November 1956, spent some time living in the Belgian Congo, and moved to Charleroi in Belgium when he was 3. The area they lived in was poor and run down, and it was a crime hotspot. His parents were teachers, his father had numerous affairs, and his parents got divorced when he was 13. The most dramatic thing that allegedly happened to the 15-year-old Dutroux was that his mother, Janine, then became romantically involved with one of her 17-year-old students, and Dutroux didn't like the idea of having to answer to some snot-nosed idiot who now thought that he could tell him what to do. That's got to be so weird, because he's 2... Your stepdad's 2 years older than you. He might even go to the same school as you. That's f***ed up, Mum. What the hell? And I know he's Belge, but the French are into this as well. Isn't Macron? He's married to, his teacher from, back in the day. It's weird. In my opinion, allegedly. This resulted in 16-year-old Dutroux leaving home and becoming either a drifter or a sex worker. It has also been suggested that he used to live with an older man who expected the teenage Dutroux to have sex with him. We're not sure. What we do know is that Marc Dutroux is a born psychopath. After leaving school, Dutroux trained to become a mechanic and got involved in petty crimes, which included selling stolen car parts. In 1976, the 20-year-old Dutroux married his first wife, Françoise, who was just 17 at the time. 2017, that's okay. I mean, in Europe. Right? And it's not, maybe that is a bit weird. It's close to being weird. And they would go on to have 2 sons. In 1979, half your age plus 7. 17. Okay. Yeah. It meets the rule. And they would go on to have 2 sons. In 1979, he was arrested and charged with crimes related to the violent muggings of old ladies, drug dealing, and car theft, and spent 3 months in prison. Now, we know that some criminals are made in prison, and the same can be said for Dutroux, whose crimes only escalated once he was released. In the early 80s, Dutroux became even more entrenched in the criminal underworld and made a lot of trips to what was then known as Czechoslovakia, where he'd be accused of sexually assaulting several girls. He also started hanging out at ice rinks in and around Charleroi, where he made a habit of tripping or bumping into female skaters. Creepy dude. He'd then apologized profusely and held them up, taking the opportunity to fill them up as much as he could while he had an excuse to be near them. Marc Dutroux sounds like a bit of an incel. This is where he met Michelle Martin, who was around 20 at the time. The two of them started an affair, and François divorced Dutroux in 1983, explaining that he was unfaithful and abusive towards her. Michelle and Dutroux moved in together and would eventually have 3 sons. Still, this didn't stop Dutroux from chatting up girls, but he was now fast approaching his 30s, and teenage girls felt creeped out by this greasy old man and avoided him like the plague. Yeah, he's also he's a born psychopath, right? So he doesn't care how other people feel. According to Michelle, I remember that Marc Dutroux accused me that I was responsible for the fact that he could no longer seduce as many women as he would have liked. He thought that other women were less interested in him because he lived with me. I remember we even slept separately for a while back then. It was at that time that Marc Dutroux told me he was planning to kidnap girls. He told me that kidnapping and sexually assaulting them took less time than hitting on them. That is some psycho shit right there. He said that would be to my advantage too, that he had way more time to spend on me. And because he did it all for me, I had to help him with the kidnappings. I don't see how that logic works, Marco. At the time, an ex-soldier named Jean Van Peteghem was living in an old caravan in their backyard. He'd recently moved to the city, was unemployed, and had just broken up with his wife. She was friends with Michelle Martin, and Dutroux graciously offered him a place to stay. In Jean's mind, Dutroux had literally picked him up off the street, had given him money and a place to live, and he felt indebted to Dutroux. He'd already been Dutroux's partner in petty crime for a few months, and when Dutroux invited him to join him for a fun night out, Jean agreed. Quoting, "We were eating at the table. At one point, Dutroux said he was planning to have fun. Martin protested briefly because Dutroux wanted to use her car. It wasn't until we were in the car that Dutroux said that he wanted to kidnap a girl." Bro. On the 7th of June 1985, they abducted 11-year-old dude, Sylvie D. She'd spent the day at a public pool with her father and older brother, and when they were on their way home that evening, Dutroux pointed her out. He was driving, so Jean was the one who opened the passenger side door, grabbed Sylvie, and covered her eyes with duct tape before they sped off. They took her to a garage, where they threatened to kill her if she made a sound. They then took photos of Sylvie, telling her it was for American Magazine, before Dutroux finally had his way with her. But when he asked Jean if he wanted to join in, Jean refused. Quote, "She was too young. I got out of the car, but I did think I had to kidnap her because I owed something to Dutroux. Tell you what, however much you owe to someone, it's not that much. You owe it to the girl to call the police or just fucking give him a good stabbing. Just give him a little stabby stab. Be like, don't be doing that. Everyone will be chill with it. No jury's going to convict you." They drop Sylvie off. It's like, why'd you stab him? Well, he manipulated me into kidnapping an 11-year-old who he was abusing, and I stabbed him to death. Just the jury bursts into applause. They dropped Sylvie off near a hospital and sped off. Sylvie would later tell police everything that had happened to her. On the 17th of October 1985, Dutroux and an unknown middle-aged man attacked 19-year-old Maria V. She'd been out shopping and was walking down the sidewalk when a man grabbed her from behind and shoved her into a van. They took her to a house, took photos of her, and dropped her off once they'd finished assaulting her. On the 14th of December 1985, an 18-year-old medical student named Axel D. was on her way to visit her parents after spending the weekend studying for an exam. She'd taken the train to Charleroi, caught a bus to Nalin, and was walking to her parents' house when she realized that she was being followed. I was being followed by a dirty white van. The van passed me. A little further, a man got out. He stood behind the van. As I wanted to walk past, both back doors opened. One man pulled me in, while the other man pushed me in the back. Once I got in, they tried to make me feel comfortable. They said they would demand a ransom of 400,000 francs from my parents. They wanted that money because their friend had a rare vascular disease and needed surgery in the United States. They put the tape over her eyes and took her to a house where they kept her locked in a room and took photos of her. The two men took turns assaulting the girl and gave her fruit juice and chocolates to eat. One of her kidnappers told her that he was part of a gang and was an expert in martial arts, and her cringe. And her second kidnapper told her that he'd once studied law, and then went on to explain how the pre-trial detention system worked. A day after she'd disappeared, they dropped her and her belongings off outside of her parents' house, and Axel would later tell the police that they'd stolen her pencil case and 3,000 francs out of her bags. On the 18th of December, 15-year-old Elizabeth G. was riding a bicycle to school when she disappeared. According to Jean, Dutroux had gone on a reconnaissance trip beforehand. He had chosen her. We dragged her from her bicycle into the van. Michelle was at the wheel while we put tape over her eyes. They took Elizabeth to their house, where Dutroux took nude photos and videos of her. He assaulted Elizabeth and told her that she was being punished for something her father had done. That evening, they dropped her off near the house and gave her 500 francs so that she could visit a doctor and get a note for school. That's f***ing weird. On January the 31st of 1986, 18-year-old Catherine B. was walking down the sidewalk when she was grabbed from behind and dragged into a vehicle. Her attackers put tape over her eyes, assaulted her, took photos of her, and then dropped her off at 9:30 p.m. that night. For her trouble, they gave her some candy and an apple. All 5 of the girls had spoken to the police. All 5 of them told similar stories, and it turned out that Jean had been particularly chatty, so much so that around the 3rd of February 1986, the police were able to arrest Marc Dutroux, Jean Van Petegem, and Michelle Martin on suspicion of the kidnapping and sexual assault of Sylvie, Maria, Axel, Elizabeth, and Catherine. Well, okay, great! You've covered... So you've done a kidnapping, Mark, and you're being careful to cover the people's eyes so they don't see your face. Great. But then you're just having a chat with them? And revealing all of these details? You dumbass. Following their arrest, the police searched their homes and found Axel's pencil case in Jean's house. When he was confronted with the evidence of his crimes, Jean told the police everything and admitted that he and Dutroux had attacked 2 more girls in May 1985, but the police were never able to track them down or identify some of Dutroux's other accomplices. Michelle initially denied any involvement, but later admitted that she'd acted as the driver during some of the kidnappings and had been the one to take the photos of the girls. It was around this time that Michelle and Dutroux got married, after which she retracted her statements, claiming that they couldn't force her to provide evidence against her new husband. Really? Oh, I guess that's a thing, like, where because you're like one legal body or something weird like that. Marc Dutroux, though, reportedly denied everything, and according to Nieuwsblad, a Dutch newspaper, Dutroux called himself a victim of a miscarriage of justice and of society. But according to Michelle, Dutroux was furious that Jean had ratted him out and had told her that if he had known that Jean would rat him out, he would have killed him immediately after the kidnappings. On the 26th of April 1989, Marc Dutroux, Michelle Martin, and Jean Van Petegem all were found guilty of the kidnapping and assault of Sylvie, Maria, Axel, Elizabeth, and Catherine. Some of these people were real young. And these are major crimes. I feel like, even though it's Europe, do consecutive sentencing, not concurrent, and then sentence 10 years, 10 years, 10 years, 10 years. That's a good 50 years. That seems good. How old is he? He's 30? He'll probably die in prison. However, Dutroux was sentenced to 13.5 years in prison, Jean 6.5, and Michelle 5 years. Which is not good enough. And this is the point where Simon asks, but we know he's going to kidnap some more girls, right? Emma spent the first half of the script telling us all about it. And this is the point where I say, you're not going to like what comes next. If they say he gets out of prison earlier than 13.5 years, that's going to be batty insane. While he was in prison, Dutroux had more than enough time to decide what he was going to do once he got out. One of the other inmates told Dutroux how he'd built hidden rooms underneath his house to hide weapons and drugs in, and told him that a lot of old European homes had cisterns built close or next to the cellar where they used to keep water. Find the cistern, and you have an unmapped secret room that you could easily hide from view. Is that true? With secret rooms? Do I have a secret room in my house? What is a cistern? One of Dutroux's old cellmates, Danielle, explains that Dutroux often bragged about his old exploits, but always denied sexually assaulting the girls. Dutroux once told him that the police had shown him a video that Michelle had taken of one of the girls, and then laughed when he explained that the blindfolded girl had fallen off the couch she'd been made to stand on. That was when Daniel knew Dutroux was guilty of every charge against him. Quoting, "At one point he told me that he wanted to build a hiding place, extremely well built and discreet, and he explained what he actually did a few years later. And he told me that he needed help to build it. I said, 'Listen, I'm not interested. Why would I help you do that?' And he said, 'Well, you can hide your drugs there.' And at that point, I clicked and said, 'You want to build that to hide girls?' And he didn't answer. And then I remember clearly when I saw on television years later that it was Marc Dutroux who kidnapped those girls. And I thought, oh my God, he did it." But before he could build this hiding place, he had to get out of prison. So Dutroux did his best to convince the prison authorities that he was a model prisoner. He attended AA meetings despite not being an alcoholic, claimed that his interest in sexually abusing young girls had simply been a phase, and as a reward for his good behavior, he was granted several supervised visits to his sick grandmother's house. His prison-appointed guardian was impressed with the level of care and devotion he showed his ailing grandmother, but Dutroux's mother, Janine, would later explain that he'd used these visits to make an inventory of his mother's belongings so that he could later sell them off once he was released from prison. Janine even wrote several letters to the prison's director to warn them not to fall for Dutroux's act. "I have known for a long time, and with good cause, my eldest's temperament. What I do not know, and what all the people who know him fear, is what he has in his mind for the future." That's pretty fucking scary. In 1992, the then Minister of Justice, Melchior Waltherley, announced a general plan to release several convicted criminals in an attempt to lessen their burden on the country's coffers. Well, how about we release the non-violent criminals? How about we don't release the one who kidnaps young girls? How about that instead? Or the state just bears the cost of keeping horrible people in prison. And yes, Marc Dutroux and several other sexual offenders were included in this list. Why? In his book, Mapping Murder, psychologist David Cantor explains that at the time, the Belgian authorities simply didn't think the sexual abuse of a child was that big of an issue. And if someone chose to have sex with a child, quote, "it may be considered evidence that the adult is too socially inept or unattractive to obtain an adult partner." I don't understand how that doesn't make it a fucking big deal. They then, what? They then concluded that these sexual offenders didn't pose a significant risk to the rest of society. What are you talking about? Where did you get your degree, David? What the fuck? Oh, I'm sorry. I don't mean David. David wrote the book and is saying that it's insane. It's the Belgian authorities. I'm so sorry, David. You're the good guy in this situation. The Belgian authorities are the ones that are smoking the crack. God damn! They then concluded that these sexual offenders didn't pose a risk to society. Anyway, because he'd been such a model prisoner, Dutroux was set to appear before the parole board. The prison chaplain told the board about how remorseful Dutroux was, and his guardian sang his praises and told the parole board just how kind and attentive Dutroux had been whenever he'd visited his grandmother. The king's prosecutor, who'd helped put him away, argued that Dutroux was still a danger to society, and the prison psychiatrist explained that Dutroux didn't fit the profile of a child fiddler, but he was mentally ill and was receiving treatment for his mental condition. The cautionary letters that Janine had written to the prison authorities were ignored, and somehow Dutroux's release from prison was approved. This is insane. It's insane that he only got 13 years, and it's insane that they're letting him go early. Dutroux was released from prison on the 8th of April 1992 after having spent just 6 years and 2 months of his 13-year sentence in prison. Since he'd somehow managed to convince the prison psychiatrist that he was mentally disabled, he was able to apply for disability allowance, which amounted to 80,000 francs or $1,200 a month, which meant that he didn't have to work anymore. He then started complaining about not being able to sleep, and his doctors gave him Rohypnol to help with that. Rohypnol's the date R-word drug, right? Rohypnol? Roofies. Rohypnol, right? He then stole his ailing grandmother's house out from right under her and ended up owning at least 7 properties all over Belgium. What, for $1,200 a month? Dutroux and his family initially moved to a derelict house he owned on Rue de Philippeville in Charleroi, and for the next 3 years, Dutroux continued with his usual criminal activities. On the 6th of December 1995, he was arrested for vehicle theft and sentenced to spend 3 months in prison. He was released on the 20th of March 1996, and on the surface, things carried on as usual. At least, that's what the police officers who'd had his place under surveillance would later claim. Operation Othello. And the time, the police service in Belgium was organised into 3 separate branches. The municipal or local police, which handled day-to-day petty crimes, the judicial police, which handled bigger crimes, and the gendarmerie. The gendarmerie had been created in 1830 as a military police force and was mostly tasked with keeping the peace during demonstrations, riots and protests. But they were also Belgium's equivalent of Scotland Yard, or the FBI, and had an entire department dedicated to investigating organised crime, which was called the BSD. I get the feeling they're not going to be talking to each other. Usually when it's like, oh yeah, we bring up all the different police forces, and then it's like, oh yeah, they just miscommunicated something, and so some dude is like free. And they had all the information to catch him, they just didn't share. From my understanding, the judicial police, on the other hand, worked much like the National Prosecuting Authority here in South Africa, or the District Attorney's Office in the US. So they're the people who decide whether to prosecute, like the, what do we call it in the UK? The, God damn it, it's escaping my mind. The people, Crown Prosecution Service, who decides whether it goes forward. As soon as an investigation into a major crime was opened, a prosecutor and an investigating judge would be appointed to the case, and they would lead the investigation. It was then up to the judge to decide whether or not they were going to prosecute, and that same judge would be judging the case when it went to trial. But more than one of my sources explain that the gendarmerie and the judicial police were rivals, and when Julie and Melissa went missing in 1995, the pressure was on to find them and to finally prove once and for all who the superior investigating force was. Yeah, but so they're not going to be sharing information. Is this really where we're going? Like, I get that I get that you want to measure your dicks, everybody. But when there are people missing who would be really nice to recover, maybe we should put them back in our pants and instead actually do our fucking jobs, huh? Maybe Belgium? Come on. In the days following their disappearance, the judicial police were talking to witnesses and following up leads, but the gendarmerie already had an advantage. They had several witnesses who told them that Marc Dutroux had most likely been the one who'd kidnapped the 2 girls, and that the red car matched the description of a vehicle that belonged to one of Dutroux's known accomplices. And it was around this point, during my research, that I started swearing profusely. You'll soon see why. Let me guess, they're not talking to each other. They're not talking to each other, that's the problem. Shortly after his release from prison, Dutroux had befriended a neighbour of his called Claude Thoreau. Claude explains that Dutroux had come across as a well-spoken and friendly guy and had asked him to help out with some renovations he was doing around the house. Dutroux explained that he'd discovered a cistern next to his cellar and that he'd dug a hole down into the ground to access it. So, I guess a cistern, like to me a cistern is like that thing where the boiling water goes, right? And I guess back in the day it was like a big room devoted to holding water or some such. When Claude asked Dutroux what he was planning on doing with the cisterns, Dutroux joked that it was the perfect place to keep girls in. Bro, that's a creepy thing to say, even as a joke. I mean, just say prisoners or something. Yeah, it's a great place to keep prisoners in my dungeon. That's funny. Being like, it's a great place to keep teenage girls is fucking creepy. Claude didn't know what to make of this, but sometime later, we saw 2 young girls walking along the street, and he said, "Do you want to earn 150,000 Belgian francs?" And I said, "Sure, but how?" And then he said, "We had to kidnap the girls first, and then he'd show me." And I said, "Listen, I don't go around kidnapping young girls." And he said, "Look, it's easy. You grab them from behind the neck with one arm, cover their mouths, and then you throw them in the back of the van. You can then knock them out if you need to." I said, "No way, I'm not going to do that." And after he dropped me off at home, I immediately called the police and reported it, as any normal person should. If there was any other reaction than, I went home and cracked a beer and watched some TV, it'd be like, no. If someone says this to you, even if you're their friend, fucking call the police, because they're up to some weird shit. And if they're not, fine, the police will check it out. No one's upset. You're not wasting any police time. Please report that shit. Claude became a police informant and reported all of Dutroux's movements to the local gendarmerie. This included the people he was seen with, which cars he drove, which cars his acquaintances drove, and how he spent his time. And then, Julie and Melissa went missing. According to Claude, when I heard about the disappearance of Julie and Melissa, I suspected that Marc was involved, and I went back to the police. He wasn't the only one. Janine, Dutroux's mother, had also contacted the police to let them know that Dutroux was keeping 2 girls in a cage, and his neighbors were complaining about the amount of noise coming from his house. Are you fucking shitting me? How are the police not bursting down that door, going into his cistern, because Claude told them that he said he was going to keep girls in there, and being like, "Hello girls, we've come to rescue," and they're like, "Yay!" But instead I get the feeling that's not what's going to happen, which is insane. Then Anne and Yveche went missing, and their parents launched a campaign against the judicial police and accused them of not doing their jobs on public television. Good. The gendarmerie wanted to show the public that they were the superior investigating force, so they started an investigation into Dutroux called Operation Othello. The file on him was extensive, and it included all of the reports of his past crimes, his arrests, the time he spent in prison, and the reports that had been made against him. The gendarmerie added their own reports to this file, as it included information on Dutroux's known associates, his wife Michelle and their children, members of his family, and what information they had regarding the properties he owned. They also placed Dutroux under surveillance and kept an eye on his movements, only not all the time. What? There's enough evidence to go to his house! Go into his house! You have an informant! You have weird noises! You know him! Yeah, go! They just observed him during daylight hours. Couldn't expect them to hang around his house at night, could you? I don't know, maybe you could. Maybe, instead of just having daytime surveillance, maybe you just do rotate 3 shifts. This seems worth it. This is a proper crime, Belgian police. They also didn't follow him around when he left the house. What the f***? Who wants to watch a child-fiddling creep cruise around in his van all day? They had better things to do, like take little afternoon naps and read the newspaper in their comfy little cars. Then news reached them that Marc Dutroux, an accomplice of his, Bernard Weinstein, and a man named Philip Divers had stolen a van. The van was later discovered in a hangar, and Divers later linked Dutroux and Weinstein to the theft. A warrant was issued for Weinstein's arrest, and the judicial police eventually arrested Dutroux in December 1995 and obtained a warrant to search his properties for any evidence relating to the theft. Great. Just go in there and be like, yeah, we really think you could be hiding stolen things like fucking people in that room in the basement. So we really need to search in there. That's what the search warrant's for. Let's go. Again, do I think that's what's going to happen? Absolutely not. The gendarmerie never told the judicial police that they had a suspicion that Dutroux had kidnapped both Julie and Melissa. They never told the police that his house had been under surveillance. They just sat and watched as the investigative team arrived to search the house. Wait, so the investigative team doesn't know about the potential kidnappings. They just literally think they're following up about a van theft. Ooh, this is nuts. You gotta talk to each other. A detective named René Michaud was in charge of searching the house on Rue de Philippeville in Charleroi, and he was accompanied by a locksmith named Lejeune. They came across 13 videotapes that were subsequently submitted into evidence, and on the 13th of December 1995, they discovered the unfinished cellar, but didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. But at some point during the search, Lejeune told Detective Michaud that he was sure he heard children speaking somewhere inside the house. Detective Michaud later explained that a family with 2 daughters had been standing on the street outside the house, so he told Lejeune that the voices must have been coming from outside. I mean, again, I got plenty of problems with what the police have been up to here, but that's not unreasonable. They returned to the house again on the 19th of December 1995 and again found no evidence that led them to believe that Marc Dutroux was more than a car thief. Of course, they had the videotapes, and one of them was clearly labelled Julie and Melissa. Are you apps? Oh, well, they don't know. They don't know who Julie and Melissa are, do they? The footage captured there showed exactly what Dutroux had done to those 2 girls and would have been more than enough to link him to their disappearance. On one of those tapes, Marc Dutroux was even filmed while he was building the cage, and he proudly explained in detail what he was going to do with it. Don't videotape an advanced confession of your crimes. That's crazy. He even shows the viewer how the hidden door to the cage works. What the f*** is he? He wants to become like a DIY YouTuber. Like, what are you doing? And yet no one even bothered to watch those tapes. When they finally did, they were too late to save Julie and Melissa. No! Oh no, I just thought they'd be rescued too late. Don't say that. 24 hours. Back in Bertrix, a member of the gendarmerie approached King's prosecutor, Michel Burlet, and Inspector Judge Connerat to explain that he had identified a likely suspect. What's more, the officer had been a part of Operation Othello, so he was able to provide the investigative team with all the information that the gendarmerie had collected on Dutroux. Burlet explains that he provided us with all the information from that dossier, which they had been collecting since July 1995. With such strong evidence, obviously, Monsieur Connerat and I decided immediately to take major action concerning Marc Dutroux. Excellent, let's go! They got a warrant, and on the 13th of August 1996, over 40 police officers were sent out to put Dutroux's properties under surveillance. Then one of the officers reported that they'd found Dutroux. His white Renault Traffic was parked outside of a house in Sarre-le-Beaussier that belonged to Michel, and this gave the police enough cause to arrest Dutroux, Michel Martin, and a known drug addict and accomplice of Dutroux named Michel Lelivre. All of them were taken back to Charleroi and were questioned about the whereabouts of Laetitia Delhez. The police searched all of Dutroux' properties, including the one on Rue de Philippeville, but found no trace of Letitia. According to Sabine, we hadn't heard a squeak. Letitia had been fast asleep, and I should have been sleeping too. But in any case, if we'd heard the slightest noise, we'd have frozen until we heard the words in the accent that could curdle blood. It's me. But Borlée and his men were running out of time, since they could only hold their suspects for 24 hours, and Borlée got frustrated with the way the gendarmerie were conducting the interrogations. One team was interrogating Dutroux, and another was interrogating Lelièvre, but no one was speaking to Michel. When Borlée suggested that one of the judicial police's teams could start interrogating Michel, the captain of the gendarmerie started complaining about how the judicial police were trying to take over their investigation. Put your penises away and get on with the investigation. This is ridiculous. Quoting, while having this altercation with the gendarmerie, I walked up to the window and see a guy leaving the station. And I said, who's that? And someone said, it was Lelièvre. And I asked, is he leaving? Yes, they said. The investigators don't think he'd done anything wrong. And then another investigator arrived who'd been questioning neighbors at Dutroux' house in Marcinelle, and Dutroux' neighbors had said that they'd seen Dutroux arrive home in the van on Friday night, along with Michel and Lelièvre, and I said, well, he just fucked off out the door. At that point, all the police, again, started looking for Lelièvre. They found the nerdy Lelièvre an hour later, trying to flee to Slovakia, and rearrested him. They found him he was trying to flee to Slovakia, and they found him within an hour. He's such a dumbass. Borlée took control of the interrogations, and in the early hours of the 15th of August 1996, Lelièvre broke. He was suffering from withdrawal by that point, and finally admitted to the police that he'd helped Dutroux to kidnap Letitia, giving Borlée the cause they needed to keep interrogating their three suspects. Sergeant Michael Dumoulin was one of the officers responsible for interrogating Dutroux, quoting him here, I realized at one point that Dutroux was a vain person, and he needed to be recognized and to be respected for what he was, so I worked with that as well, then quote. By now, Dutroux had been sitting in that investigation room for almost 24 hours, and around 4 a.m. on the morning of the 15th of August, Sergeant Dumoulin told Dutroux that he knew he'd kidnapped Letitia. Sergeant Dumoulin told Dutroux that they knew he'd pulled Letitia into his van, just like he'd done with Sylvie, Marie, Axel, Elizabeth, and Catherine. They knew that he'd then taken Letitia to his house in Rue de Philippeville, that they'd rolled her up in a blanket and carried her into the house. The neighbors had seen them, and they knew about the cage, about his plans to keep the girls there. Then Dumoulin explained that they were going to take Dutroux to the house, and they wanted him to show them where he was keeping Letitia. And then Dutroux said, it's not one girl I'm going to give you, but two girls, before he pointed to the wall behind Dumoulin's head where Sabine's smiling face was looking down at them. 80 days. According to Sabine, quote, it was the afternoon of 15th of August. I'd already put a cross over that date. I'd done it before, when he hadn't been down to annoy us, and it signified a day of truce in this everyday war against evil. One more day, and I would have been there 80 days, and the same number of nights. Letitia was taking a nap, and Sabine was writing in one of her books when they heard the voices. Then there was the sound of dozens of boots walking up ahead and men calling out, and the two girls hid underneath their blanket, convinced that the boss and his men were coming for them and that they were going to die. Quoting again, first we heard the noise of the bricks being scraped across the cellar floor, and then the clank and hump of bottles being moved, and then the low thump of plastic containers being taken out from the shelves. Now I was truly afraid. Naked fear, the sort you can't hide, knowing that death was on its way. And then we heard his voice, exactly as it always was. It's me. I'm coming in. But Sabine and Letitia didn't trust this new development and were convinced that Dutroux was going to hand them over to the boss and his people. The door was opened, and still the two girls refused to make a sound. It was only when Letitia recognized one of the police officers from Bertrix that the two girls realized that they'd been saved, quoting again. At the time, though everything was happening so quickly and I was trying to make sense of it, I just thought that he must have got bored with the situation and, not knowing how to get out of it, had called for the police. Convinced that Dutroux had done his best to help them, Sabine asked if she could take the coloured pencils he'd given her with her, and he said that she could. In an adrenaline-fueled daze, she and Letitia then both kissed him on the cheek as a thank you for finally letting them go. Yeah, that I don't even know what to say to that. Quoting her again, as for that thank you, if only I'd had the wit to spit in his face, when I think how I missed this opportunity. Sabine explains that she and Letitia then fell into the arms of the nearest police officers, Sergeant André Colin and Sergeant Michael Dumoulin, whom Sabine would always refer to as being her real savior. Years later, Dumoulin would tell her, "You didn't want to let go. You were holding on to me so tight." The two girls were then led out of the house and put in the back of a police car, much to the astonishment of the journalists who'd surrounded the house en route to Philippeville. That night, people all over Belgium heard that Letitia and Sabine Dardenne had been found alive and well, and their tearful reunions with their families were broadcast for everyone to see. Their rescue had also kindled flames of hope in the heart of the parents of Julie, Melissa, and Yvesha, and they hung to the hope that this meant their daughters might also still be alive. The White March. But it was not to be. Sadly, after Sabine and Letitia were found alive, Dutroux finally admitted to having kidnapped both Julie and Melissa, and would later confess to having kidnapped both Anne and Yvesha. On the 17th of August 1996, 2 days after Sabine and Letitia were rescued, police discovered the remains of 3 people: Julie, Melissa, and Bernard Weinstein, who'd been buried in the backyard of the house where Michelle Martin had been living at the time. And on the 3rd of September 1996, the police located the remains of Anne and Yvesha buried on another one of Dutroux's properties that had been leasing out to Bernard Weinstein. Michelle told the police that Dutroux and Weinstein often stole cars together and had been business partners. Weinstein had helped Dutroux to abduct Anne and Yvesha, and after news got out in October 1995 that there was a warrant out for Weinstein's arrest, Dutroux had decided that Weinstein was a liability. If Dutroux wanted to avoid going to prison, he had to get rid of him. But Dutroux knew that Weinstein had just received a large amount of money from his mother, so Dutroux first drugged Weinstein and then tortured him until he told Dutroux where the money was. Dutroux then buried him alive in November 1995. Jesus Christ, that's some psycho shit, burying someone alive. But Dutroux would later claim that Weinstein had been the one who'd sexually assaulted both Anne and Yvesha, and that he had threatened to kill Julie and Melissa. Dutroux insisted that he had only killed Weinstein to keep him from hurting the 2 girls. Yeah, dude, you got 2 witnesses right there who are going to be like, no, Dutroux, also a massive piece of shit, and he killed Weinstein. Dutroux would later explain that at one point, all 4 of the girls were living in the house on Rue de Philippeville. Anne and Yvesha were in the cage, and Julie and Melissa were kept upstairs. But Anne and Yvesha never stopped putting up a fight. Yvesha had even managed to escape on more than one occasion by climbing through the sunroof of the house on Rue de Philippeville, and Dutroux had then decided that it was too risky to keep the 2 teenagers since it was too difficult to control them. He drugged them both with Rohypnol and then buried them alive. Bro, this is some psycho shit. Burying people alive is fucked up. Don't be doing that. Michelle would later testify that after Dutroux was arrested in December 1995, she'd been supposed to feed Julie and Melissa, but that she didn't want to face the 2 8-year-olds, so she had just avoided the house and allowed them to starve to death. What the fuck? What the fuck, man? It didn't work, of course. He was public enemy number 1. The entire country was grieving the loss of Julie, Melissa, Anne, and Yvesha, and a state funeral was held for Julie and Melissa. Anne and Yvesha's parents wanted a smaller affair, but hundreds of people still showed up in their hometown to mourn the 2 teenagers. The media reported that 3 of the letters Sabine had written to her family were discovered hidden underneath a doormat in the house on Rue de Philippeville. The police had also found the photos and videos he'd taken of her and Letitia, and had finally started watching the 13 videotapes they'd confiscated back in December 1995. Then the media started reporting on Marc Dutroux's past crimes and the fact that he was released early. Then the details regarding Operation Othello leaked, the investigating judge on the case, Jean-Marc Connereau, was fired, and all hell broke loose. Yeah, I'm not fucking surprised. Someone has to pay for this fucking incompetence. You see, the public viewed Judge Connereau and King's prosecutor Michael Borlet as heroes for saving both Letitia and Sabine. They and their families had been invited to attend a spaghetti dinner hosted by Letitia's family, and Dutroux's lawyers argued that Judge Connereau was no longer objective. This was a problem since he would not only be the judge during Dutroux's trial, but also in any case where the victims' families wanted to either sue Dutroux or the state, which meant that by attending this dinner, his objectivity was in question, so Judge Connereau had to go. I get why you would do this, though, but you gotta think like a judge, my dude. You can't go to dinner with one side. The people of Belgium saw his proof that the government was trying to cover up Dutroux's crimes and the government's role in all of it, and within days, Belgium was on the brink of revolution. Wait, what's the government got to do with this? You have separation of powers, Belgium. The police should be held accountable by the courts and the government. Crowds started gathering outside government buildings on the 14th of October 1996 and were carrying signs that read, "I'm ashamed to be a Belgian." Tensions were rising to a fever pitch, but the parents of Julie, Melissa, Anne, and Yvesha called for peace and helped arrange a white march in memory of their daughters and every other victim of child abuse, including 2 girls who are still missing, Lubna Benessa and Elizabeth Brochet. On the 20th of October 1996, 300,000 people took to the streets, all of them either wearing white, carrying white flowers, or holding onto white balloons. Fire trucks sprayed government buildings with water to wash them of their sins, and the government followed Letitia and Sabine as they marched along with the rest of their countrymen. That's intense. The fire department's even like, yeah, f*** you government, piece of shit. Quoting, "The march was held to honour the missing children, but also to celebrate Letitia's and my survival. So our position with regard to the other families was, to put it mildly, tense. Yet I was alive. Yes, I was alive, but that didn't mean I wasn't affected by the death of the other girls. All I wanted was to lend my support to the parents who had lost a child, the parents who had just buried a child, the parents who were still searching. Yet how could I make things easier for them? I was living evidence of their distress. It was unbearable." After the march, tensions died down a bit, but the Belgian people were still out for blood, and a parliamentary inquiry was launched into the investigation surrounding the disappearances of Julie, Melissa, Anne, Yvecha, Sabine, and Letitia. It lasted for 17 months, and during this time, the Belgian public became convinced that Dutroux had been involved in an elite P-word sex ring, and that the police and the government were trying their utmost to cover it up. I mean, I wouldn't call it an elite anything, but there was a ring, there was a group of them. I suppose if you want to call it a ring, that makes it sound way more organized than it actually was, rather than it just being one dude and a few other dudes who are just massive pieces of shit doing their pieces of shit thing, and let's just throw them in prison and throw away the key. Come on. And when news broke that a well-known businessman named Michael Nihol was somehow involved in Dutroux' crimes, it only added fuel to the fire that sounded very reminiscent of the whole #Epstein didn't kill himself saga. It had been reported on the day that Letitia was kidnapped, Dutroux and Nihol had been in constant communication with each other. Why? Why would these random, successful businessmen and, Dutroux, who just seems to be, just a piece of shit, why would they be talking to each other? Nihol had also got ties to the Hotel Brazil, which was a brothel and one of the last places where Anne and Yvecha were last seen. Wait, I thought that was the bar. Didn't they say they went to a pub or a bar or something? It was actually a brothel? And then a woman came forward to explain that she had been trafficked as a young child and that she'd seen Dutroux at sex parties that were hosted by Nihol. Sex parties where children were often tortured and at least one of them died. Okay, well there's the reason that our businessman is involved with Dutroux, because he's also allegedly a piece of shit. I'm not going to go into conspiracy theories regarding Nihol's alleged crimes here, since they're only tangentially related to this case. Okay, yeah, let's just be careful there. All that's alleged. We don't know it for sure. That's what the media were saying. That's all we're saying here. We're not alleging anything. I'm not going to go into the conspiracy theories regarding Nihol's alleged crimes, since they're only tangentially related, but both Sabine and Letitia insisted that Dutroux was the only person who's assaulted them, and I honestly already have had my fill of these arseholes. But if there is anything to the story, I will cover it eventually, just not on this channel, since it's too dark even for the casual criminalist. Oh my lord. Anyway, in October 1997, the inquest, known as the Dutroux affair, found that the whole justice system had failed Julie, Melissa, Anne, Yvecha and their families. They also found that the gendarmerie had failed to work with the local police and judicial police forces, which indirectly led to the deaths of Julie and Melissa. Multiple ministers and high-ranking officials resigned, and the gendarmerie was disbanded in 2001. The whole justice system in Belgium was restructured, and it now consists of the federal police and the local police. New procedures for investigating crimes against children were implemented, and hopefully the entirety of Belgium is better off for it. But according to Sabine, she knew that she couldn't move on with her life until Marc Dutroux' trial was over. Quoting, "At the age of 12, the word psychopath meant nothing to me, and even now at 20, I still don't really understand what goes on in a mind like that. All I know is that I wanted to see the psychopath face to face, eyeball to eyeball. When I was 12, they stopped me, no doubt for my own protection. I had to wait a full 8 years to finally have the chance. And this time, it was he who was forced to lower his eyes." D. The Damned. Marc Dutroux' murder trial started on the 1st of March 2004. He'd been charged with the murders of Anne, Yvecha, and Bernard Weinstein. He was also charged with multiple counts of car theft, kidnapping, attempted murder, attempted kidnapping, and molestation. During their preparation for the trial, the prosecution had discovered 3 more women whose assaults had been recorded on the videotapes found at Dutroux' home, and 3 more charges of sexual assault were added to his charge sheet. Michel Martin, Michael Lelivre, and Michael Nihol were being tried as accomplices, and all 4 of the accused sat inside a specially built glass cage just in case someone decided to do the world a favor and assassinate them during the trial. You're like, oh no, it turns out the glass cage was just made out of very thin plastic and they're all been killed. Oh no! Melissa's parents had gotten a hold of the prosecution's case file, and before the trial, they had explained that the prosecution didn't have any physical evidence that proved that Dutroux had been responsible for kidnapping and assaulting their daughter. They hadn't taken DNA swabs from the girl's remains because they'd been too badly decomposed. You can get DNA from decomposed things, for sure. You can get it from inside the bones. Now, what are you talking about? I guess this was back in the day, but still, come on. Thousands of hairs have been found in the cage where the girls have been kept, but none of it was tested and compared to Dutroux. The same went for Anne, Yvesha, Sabine, and Letitia. All they had against Dutroux was his criminal history, the fact that the girls were found on his properties, and the conflicting testimonies of Dutroux, Michel Martin, and Lelivre. When Dutroux took the stand, he denied kidnapping the girls. He repeated the conspiracy theories that had been floating around and continued to claim that he'd been part of a child sex trafficking ring. Jesus Christ, when that's your backup, like, no, I wasn't doing this. I was doing this. When this is a child sex trafficking ring, you doing some bad crimes, my dude. He told the court that Nihal was the mastermind behind it all and that he'd just returned home one day to find Julie and Melissa tied up inside his house. Quote, "My wife told me we were going to keep them in the house for a few days. I didn't know they had been kidnapped." Dutroux tried to spin the same story he'd told Sabine and Letitia. He was only protecting them against the big bad boss. None of it was his fault. In fact, Weinstein was the one who'd abused the girls, not him, never him. He'd even built the little hidey hole because, quote, "I wanted to create a hiding place to spare them from being sent to a sex trafficking ring." He did admit to kidnapping and abusing Anne and Yvesha, though. He seemingly thought that the world would hate him less because they were 17 and 19 at the time, not just 8, 12, and 14. He didn't kill Anne and Yvesha, though. Lelivre and Weinstein did. Of course, Michelle told a different version of events. She admitted that she'd known what Dutroux was up to. After all, she'd been complicit in his crimes back in the 80s. She told the court that Dutroux and Weinstein had abducted Julie and Melissa. Lelivre had helped him to kidnap Anne, Yvesha, Sabine, and Letitia. Dutroux had killed Weinstein for his money. She had prepared the sandwiches, which had been laced with Rohypnol, and after Dutroux went to prison, she'd been too scared to face the 8-year-old Julie and Melissa and allowed them to starve to death. You gotta go to prison for that for a long-ass time. They're 8! Quote, "I know I have some responsibility in the deaths of Julie and Melissa. I regret infinitely what happened. Well, guess what? An apology ain't gonna cut it. You need to go to prison forever. Piece of shit." To drive home just exactly what Dutroux and others like him were capable of, Sabine had agreed that the letters he'd written to her parents should be read out in court, particularly the last one, where she explained all the really bad things that he'd done to her and how he left her body broken, bleeding, and bruised. Quoting, "Until they were read out, I don't think I fully understood the impact they would have. An unearthly silence filled the court, apart, that is, from the sound of crying. The reality of the agony room, the sexual abuse and the suffering it had caused me, which I had innocently described in the letter to my mother when I was 12 years old, were unbearable to listen to. I realized that if I had died sometime during the previous 8 years, it would not have mattered. These letters would have spoken for me." Sabine and Letitia both took the stand. Both of them were now older and wiser, but they were strong and confident and faced the middle-aged Dutroux with steely resolve. They gave their testimony, and when both Dutroux and Michel Martin offered their apologies to them, they both refused it. On the 22nd of June 2004, Dutroux was found guilty on all charges and received life imprisonment, the maximum sentence in Belgium because the death penalty had sadly been abolished in 1996. Oh my lord, that was very recently. We just missed it. That's a real shame because this deserves to die. For her part in his crimes, Michel Martin received 30 years in prison with the option of parole, and Lelivre received 25, also with the option of parole. Nihal, on the other hand, was acquitted on all charges of kidnapping and conspiracy to kidnap, but was found guilty on drug charges. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but only spent 2 years behind bars. After serving 16 years of her sentence, Michelle was released in August 2012 and went on to live in a convent for 5 years. She now lives in a safe house that belongs to a judge somewhere on a farm in the middle of the country. Lelivre spent 23 years in prison and was released on parole in 2019, with his lawyer claiming that he had matured and is no longer a danger to society. In October 2019, the 63-year-old Dutroux agreed to undergo a psychiatric evaluation in preparation for a possible release in 2021, after having served 30 years of his sentence. Why can't life sentence for someone like this mean life? Keep him in prison! However, on the 26th of October 2020, Belgian newspapers reported that the piece of shit will never step foot out of prison again, since the psychiatrist found him to be a sadistic psychopath who has no remorse for his many victims. Good. He's going to be in prison forever. I hope he rots in prison. Yes! Sisters in Sorrow. According to Sabine, quote, "A journalist asked me if Letitia and I were bosom buddies. Let's just say we have things in common," I replied, "but we're not childhood friends or school friends. Letitia and I are sisters in sorrow." During interviews, Letitia explains that after her release, she told her mother everything, every single detail of everything that had happened to her. The two cried together. Her mother loved her through all of it, and she's been able to move on. She still lives in Betrix and lives a quiet, happy life. Sabine had once apologized to her for asking for a friend all those years ago, and Letitia reportedly reassured her that none of it was her fault. Still, it took some time to work through the survivor's guilt. In her book, Sabine explains that she had her own way of working through what had happened to her. She'd learned early on that feeling sorry for herself would get her nowhere, and she'd often reminded herself that she had survived. She'd made it. And if she could survive the cage, nothing could bring her down. Besides, she had the stroppy little madam to keep her company. Quote, "Looking back, I suppose that after my release, everyone had been expecting to see a wreck, a traumatized little girl in floods of tears. But I'd done enough crying in that hole to last me a lifetime." Sabine explains that the thing she had longed for most, though, was for her life to just return to normal. She would lock herself in her room and avoid speaking to her parents. She refused to see a therapist. She refused to tell her mother what had happened to her. And when the police found the letters she'd written in that cage, she insisted that she didn't want her parents to read them. Quote, "Adults saw things differently. I was the victim of a serial sadist, and that was all they saw. A victim of child abuse. I don't want to think about it anymore. I had escaped from the jaws of death, and I was alive. No more fear. No more pain. My instinct was telling me, get back to what you know, your bed, your teddies, your everyday life." She explained that going back to school helped her a lot and helped her to carry on as if those 80 days in the cage had been a bad dream. Quoting again, "No one, neither pupils nor teachers, ever asked me a single question. Children are naturally sensitive about not prying into each other's lives. In their world, everything is much more straightforward, and if someone upsets someone, then you don't talk about it." She finished primary school and moved on to high school. When she was 16, she fell in love for the first time, and when things between her and her new love reached a certain point, Sabine sat him down and had an open conversation with him. Of course, he knew what she'd gone through, and he treated her with love and tenderness. Their relationship didn't work out, but in her words, quote, "I had leaped over the bonfire that had threatened to turn my future to ashes." Sabine has avoided the spotlight ever since, and you won't find her on social media. But she finished school, got a job, looked her abuser in the eye during the trial, and then wrote her book explaining that she's now put it all behind her and is planning on moving on with her life as if those 80 days never happened, quoting again, and for the last time today, "But if I found the courage to retrace my stations of the cross, it has been, above all, so that the lawyers should never again underestimate the damage that P-words do. Never again let them off with half their sentences still to run. Never again grant parole for good conduct without other restraints in place. Please, don't ever let them forget the past. Never again."